Let's take a look at Porter's five forces model of competition and profitability. Michael Porter developed the five forces model for an overall industry analysis approach. I was looking at competitive advantage and operations and various other aspects. Marketers have found that this is a very good tool to measure one aspect, actually five aspects, of whether a market is highly attractive or not for investments, for segmentation and target marketing decisions, and various other aspects of marketing. So let's look at the model. The five forces model has at the center of attention here is what is known as the intensity of rivalry. This just means that if you are thinking of investing in a particular market, entering a market, and you look at the competitors who are already there, what is the competitive situation? Is there a kind of every organization for itself mentality, or is it one that invites new entrants and kind of gets along with new entrants, and there's a more of a collegial atmosphere? You don't find that too often in a competitive environment. But on the other hand, even though there would be some intensity of rivalry, if it's to the extreme where the current occupants of that particular market space are constantly suing each other and doing other very antagonistic and aggressive tactics, that makes it less of a inviting target market for someone looking to get into it. So intensive rivalry, you're trying to just see how much headwind, how much resistance would we face if we entered a particular market. Okay, that's at the center. If we look to the left, you can see that for the suppliers that you would need to use to get the raw materials or component goods or whatever type of inputs you need to operate in this particular market, depending on how many of them there are and what alternatives you have as far as supply different versions of particular goods and services, the bargaining power of suppliers is another thing to look at. So the bargaining power of suppliers means if you're dealing, for instance, with the extreme where it's a monopoly, one supplier controls the access to a needed component or raw material. That's very difficult because you're kind of at the mercy of pricing, availability. You may have to shut down your production line if you can't get a particular raw material. So obviously the bargaining power there is all with the supplier. So if it's a little more balanced, it's a little more inviting. It's a little bit more of an attractive market. It's even more attractive if there are multiple suppliers and they're competing with each other to supply those who need those goods and services. And just the exact same situation on the other end with what is the outlet for the products and services we're going to be producing in that market. Okay, and that is the bargaining power of buyers. If there's one buyer, they can do the same thing that one supplier can do. And that is, for instance, if there are several entities, several companies making a particular product and only one buyer, that buyer can pit those makers against each other and do things like a reverse auction for pricing, where you have to drive your price lower and lower until it's accepted by that buyer. Okay? And of course, the more buyers there are, the better it is for you in general, but then they don't have as much power because you're not as dependent on just a handful or even one buyer. So bargaining power of buyers, the more buyers there are, the more inviting, the more attractive a particular market is. If you look at the other two, at the top, the new entrants, and at the bottom, substitutes, these are somewhat similar in the way that suppliers and buyers are. If you have threat of substitutes, that means that if you are in this market or you're considering entering this market, and whatever is being made, whatever is being produced, what are the substitutes for it? If they're easily available substitutes that can give the same benefit, that can provide the same function, provide the same service but in a different manner, then there are substitutes, and therefore that's a kind of a rival in and of itself. And so you have to take into account what kind of substitutes are there and what are the likelihood of future substitutes coming about. Obviously, the more there are substitutes for what's being produced in that market, the less attractive it would be. And the same goes with new entrants. This is a little harder to predict when you sometimes have organizations enter a market that they have traditionally don't even have any kind of interest in or association with, but through the development of technology or wanting to diversify, they decide to enter a market they've just not competed in before. So those are harder to detect. But if you've got a rival who is making something similar, or set of rivals, then the threat of new entrants can be greater. The threat of new entrants can also be increased as patents expire and other protections of a market disappear. Any kind of tariffs that are being lowered to allow more free trade, for instance, then there's going to be a threat of more new entrants coming in. If you detect that that's going to be a threat in the future, then what you're going to find is that the market will be less attractive than it would be if there's less of a threat of new entrants. So all told, the Five Forces model gives you 5 different areas to look at to try to determine how attractive a particular market might be for your investment.